This is the July 2nd City Council Workshop on the DeBary 2045 Comprehensive Plan. City Clerk, would you call the roll call, please?
Councilmember Sell,
Here.
Councilmember Papalardo,
Here.
Councilmember Stevenson,
Here.
Mayor Chazet,
Here.
Vice Mayor Butlin.
Here. Okay, we have a presentation on a portion of Volume 2 of the City of DeBary's 2045 Comprehensive Plan.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor, members of the council. Today is the 5th workshop in a series, and we are now getting into the goals, objectives, and policies. Tonight, we're going to look at our future land use element and our housing element, two of the key building blocks to our entire comprehensive plan. First, let's go and look at the future land use element. What staff has done, we did our evaluation of our current policies, objectives, our goals, objectives, and policies. We've compared them to recent legislation since the last update of the ear-based amendment for the plan. And we have a series of goals, objectives, and policies that may be either administratively or substantively changed. The future land use element, as you all know, but for the public, the future land use element determines the future general distribution, location, and extent of various land use types. It's a baseline of all things that are constructed. Land use determines density and intensity for any and each parcel of land. And the why do we have it? Well, besides steering our growth and our pattern of development, is also required by the Florida Statute 163. Looking at the year-based amendments, goals, objectives, and policies, many of them are going to be technical in nature, and they provide clarity and improve the quality, and also some of the changes will provide clarity and improve the quality of the language. Other changes that we are going to present are more substantive and will have a greater influence on the development of the city over the next few years. We looked at the changes that are going to be presented to a goal, objective, or policies, and there are 46 changes. You have been provided with your council packet a matrix that looks very much like this. Also for the public, there are matrices on the side table, and they are available online. There are 37 administrative changes. Most of those are for grammar, punctuation, formatting, or flow. Formatting, if we added policy, there may be another sub-policy or may be re-enumerated. And 9 of the changes are substantive. And those are all primarily directed by the Florida statutes or other legislative documents or laws. First on policy, we're looking at is policy 5.01. It has been rewritten and bulletized, so it follows the same pattern of Florida Statute 163.3. And states that our land use pattern is based on the following subject and topics. We didn't have that formatted in that way, so we're going to format it so it's consistent with the Florida statute and addresses all the key points. Another ear-based amendment, 5.108, has been drafted, providing for the statement of proactive coordination with Volusia County Public Schools as it is directed by the new Florida statute update to 163, which requires sufficient land proximate to residential development to meet projected needs for schools in coordination with public school boards. Our next policy we looked at that needs to be updated is policy 5.109, providing for monitoring the city's growth and adjusting population projections and updating our plan. We have done that and addressed that policy to be consistent with Florida Statute 163, of course, 3177, which requires a plan to identify procedures for monitoring and implementing the plan. So in that policy, we do put our monitoring procedures. The next policy is policy 5.302. It's been drafted establishing the High Banks node area and providing for policies regulating the development therein. If you remember, approximately 12 to 24 months ago, we went through the redrafting of the Land Development Code, and we had the High Banks node added. We had the corridors along 1792 and such. These policies clarify and bring more of a justification to the Land Development Code sections. So the policies will include improvement of the infrastructure for multimodal transportation, evaluating and monitoring the economic health, and advocating for the establishment and the uses of conductivity to improve the pedestrian bicycle experience. So we basically taking what we have in our Land Development Code and having more clarified policies for that. Also, along with that, we've drafted and established village center area policies which support our current Land Development Code regulations, and also support the village center strategy, which was a part of the 5-year strategic plan that the city had and has been established a few years ago. So policies include what you see on the slide and are more harmonious with our Land Development Code. Also, we have ear-based amendments which mitigate the impact of rapid urban sprawl. I think we do a pretty good job with that already in the city of DeBary. But we've clarified our language to be consistent with the updated Florida statute that's stated on the screen to discourage the proliferation of urban sprawl. Also, we've drafted policies to promote the redevelopment, to encourage redevelopment within the city, which if you have redevelopment in older areas, it will also mitigate instances of sprawl into new undeveloped, more undeveloped land. Policy 5.402 has been drafted, providing for the promotion, again, more urban sprawl documentation. It seems to be pretty strongly written now in the by the Florida legislative body, and we're adopting our policies to be stronger to discourage urban sprawl and encourage redevelopment of already developed properties. We have a policy 5.505, which used to be 5.405. It amends languages addressing public schools in industrial areas. Currently in our comprehensive plan, there is a conflict that states they're not permitted, but then there's another conflict that states they're permitted in all districts. This clarifies the language to preclude schools from being built in industrial land use classifications. Language has also been added to state that the city will encourage schools to be proximal to urban residential areas. The public and recreation classification has been added as a new land use to our code, to our comprehensive plan, and the public education land use has been added. These two land uses were land uses that were directed by the recent state legislative body, and this Florida statute you see on the screen is the specific Florida statute that states that. So now our comprehensive plan will have the two additional required elements. And they're further articulated in the spreadsheets which you have been earlier provided. Furthermore, on the land use element, policy 5.507, which is a substantive and a administrative change because of the enumeration. There's a policy providing for the percent distribution land uses for compliance within our DeBary Main Street. So that new policy will direct more of the densities, intensities that we've already discussed in things like the Land Development Code. But this encourages also aspects of our TOD, which we didn't have specifically as a policy, such things as parallel parking in Main Street as a policy, rather than just a directive in the Land Development Code. More legislative adds for our comprehensive plan that focus on our transit-oriented development district, which talks about off-street parking, green infrastructure, and other policies which encourage bike, ped, and other type outdoor recreational activities and deter levels of crime through assurance of well-lit areas at night. As far as land uses, we looked at four areas right now in the city. 3 of them we're going to do a little further evaluation and present that at the final adoption and hearings. What the ERA-based amendments allow us to do is to make land use changes without a separate ordinance like we would for someone wants to come forward, change a land use and zoning. That would be a separate process. We can change some land uses to make them consistent with the existing built environment. We can do that through the ERA process. We're looking at 3 possible. We're going to do a little more analysis on it. One is DeBarra Villas on the north along 1792, which has a density and intensity which does not match what's currently been built. We also have the Riverside condos, which is much more dense than the residential low to medium density land use allows. We're going to see what we'll do with that. Then also, there's a minor discrepancy on the St. John River acres. That one will probably remain. I don't see that changing, but we have to do a little bit of analysis on some aspect of that. One thing I would recommend now today, as a definite change, is the Palm Road property the city owns. It's currently has a land use of commercial retail, and that would be land use which would go to ESL, which is environmentally sensitive lands. As the property now at this time has a easement placed over it, a conservation easement placed over it, and that is the intent really of that wet property. Put it back to environmentally sensitive land, and then later come back after this is adopted with a zoning change and zone it to a conservation zoning to make it consistent with what's there on the ground. That's definitely would be recommended for a change. If we move forward to the second policy packet, that's the housing element. The housing element is, as it states, provides for the principles, guidelines, and standards and strategy for providing housing to the residents of DeBarry. It is, again, a required element by the Florida Statute Land Law on 163. As in the future land use, we do have ones that are technical in nature to provide clarity and improve quality of the language or an administrative comma or wording, and the other ones are more substantive. As you see with the housing element, with many of the recent changes to Florida law that were passed in the last several years, there are more substantive changes to the housing element, being 18 substantive changes and 11 administrative changes for grammar, punctuation, formatting, and flow. I'm going to cover more of the substantive ones now. Policy 6.104 has been drafted, providing for the cooperation with the commercial housing industry, private nonprofit agencies, and public agencies to ensure the preservation of existing affordable housing. This policy is designed to comply with the new changes to Florida Statute 163. As is this new policy, 6.105, providing for the evaluation of the potential need to diversify the supply of housing. I believe that's a thing we already do kind of intuitively and automatically in the city, but this codifies that we will have evaluate the need. And it is consistent with the newly adopted legislative laws. We also have 6.106 has been drafted for the analysis to be done prior to the increases of taxes, fees, and fines. This analysis would be for the purpose of concluding whether or not the increase in taxes, fees, or fines would reduce the supply of affordable housing. This is really something we're already doing. Whenever we bring any fee schedule forward, we do evaluate that already as a staff and as a council, but this codifies it as that we will have a policy to address it. Many of the things in the housing element are things we're already doing. So we're showing the state, yes, we we'll codify it and put a policy in to prove that we are doing it. So as in policy 6.107, we drafted that for the monitoring of the population growth and, again, the affordable housing aspect. It's a monitoring and evaluation policy, which will, again, comply with the new state law. Also, we have a policy, another policy for monitoring growth and adjusting the policies as needed. So if we have a policy that's not working, we now have a policy that states we can have a change of the policy, which I think is a little redundant, but it is required by the new Florida, the changes to the Florida statute. More on the housing element. As stated, we have amended this to ensure affordable housing is not more than a half mile away from transit services, shopping, and other community services, and it prohibits new multifamily affordable housing developments from being located within half a mile of one another, except for those located within the transit-oriented development district. That's more or less what we already do, but now we codify this policy as now required by the new Florida statute update. Another policy has been updated, which is again one of the 18 substantive ones, is policy 6.304. It is for evaluating the code of ordinances with respect to code enforcement. This came about with the latest legislation, and it is in the policy shown on the screen. Again, another policy, things we already do, a program for identifying the elements, constraints, and threats inhibiting the increase of the quality of the supply of housing or reducing the quality of housing. We do that already on an annual basis, but now we will have a policy stating we do. A lot of clarifications just to prove we're already doing what we're doing in this latest housing element. 6.401 has been drafted stating the city will evaluate its standard operating procedures with regard to the review and issuing of building permits. Yes, we do that on an annual basis already internally, so now we will have a policy stating and directing so. Again, this one, there we go, thank you. Policy 6.402, we've drafted that to promote the development of infill lots. We know that will become, probably in the 10-year horizon, that will be a lot of the focus on anything that's constructed will be infill lots or redevelopment of older lots. This policy does comply with the Florida statute 163, which has been updated. Also, we have drafted a policy stating that the Land Development Code will identify policies unnecessarily inhibiting the development of developable non-conforming lots. Well, our Land Development Code already states that, but now we will have this in our comprehensive plan. 6.404 talks about extending the infrastructure to platted lots with no infrastructure. Well, we already have policies on that. Volusia County Utilities has policies on that for extending their utilities. So there's already internal policies, but now this will be a policy that's going to be codified in our comprehensive plan and consistent with the new update to the Florida statute. We also are required to have a policy to prevent gentrification. That's moving into an older neighborhood and removing all the current residents and building all new structures. That's gentrification. I think we're all familiar with that. But we have a policy to state we will have policies to explore the prevention of such. This also deals with our vulnerability assessment that's now required. As you know, we have been working on a vulnerability assessment probably for 10 months with various agencies, the county, other state agencies. But this codifies the comprehensive plan to state to be compliant with the new Florida statute. Another requirement is to explore and consider policies to preserve aging housing stock, so we have a policy in the new update to address that. Also, there are policies that are required that direct the streamlining of the permitting process. That is something we already do. We're already consistent with the new Florida legislative. Sorry about that, excuse me. We're already consistent with the newly passed law, but we will have that in our comprehensive plan stating that we do have that as an objective and policy. Also, that we will have feedback from stakeholders in the private and non-private sectors on housing needs. Well, we do already do that in our public engagement and our intergovernmental coordination, but now we will have a policy stating that is what the city will do. This is, excuse me. This continues with a similar type policy addressing the permitting process, which we're already doing. And also, we will have a policy that we have drafted stating the city will obtain feedback, again, from stakeholders addressing the quality of housing and providing for the stability of neighborhoods. So, as you see, there are many changes to the housing element, but a lot of things we already are doing internally as a city staff and legislative body. We are, will now have the policies written, which will be mirrored and reflective of the new update to the Florida statute. And we'll submit that with our evaluation and appraisal report to the state. The next workshop we have is tentatively scheduled for the 16th of July. We'll continue with goals, objectives, and policies, but we will address economic development and transportation. So that concludes my presentation.
Okay.
Entertain your questions.
City Clerk, do we have any public participation?
No, ma'am, we do not.
Councilmember Sell, any questions or comments?
No questions or comments, thank you.
Councilmember Papalardo?
No comments.
Councilmember Stevenson?
Yes, just I would comment real quickly about gentrification. It doesn't always involve rebuilding.
Right, doesn't always involve, sometimes it's just moving in and changing the, you are correct, it doesn't necessarily always involve rebuilding, but it is a change in the face of the neighborhood, so to speak, or the character of the neighborhood.
Thank you.
Vice Mayor Butlin?
Thank you, Mayor. Just real quick, on these changes that Florida has, when do they go into effect? That's just
Well, some have gone into effect.
yesterday.
Like, okay, so I know like the streamlined permitting, that's going to be required that we're already been doing, it's like 1 October. So there's some that went into effect immediately, some that go into effect 1 October.
Okay.
And some of the policies, I think, on 1 January.
Okay.
But we could provide a breakdown on each policy if you'd like, but
No,
a lot of them are either immediate or 1 October. There's a
Okay.
few that are with the calendar year, but
that's it.
yeah. Their fiscal schedule does not match anybody else's. They go, but
That would make it way too easy.
yeah, it would.
Okay.
I just have a couple of questions. The couple of the areas you said you will look at again with existing density versus what, I guess, future land use showed. DeBerry Villas, that is one of our core assets for affordable housing.
Right.
And so I think whatever we're doing has to be an administrative thing. It can't be anything that discourages DeBerry Villas from continuing to operate as they have in the past.
Correct.
And ditto the condos at Dirksen and I-4. Now, the expansion of I-4 may take out one condo building, so you may actually have fewer units there. That remains to be seen, but it was part of the tentative plans
Right.
as far back as 2017.
Right. And that's one
So-
thing, I'm sorry.
So that would reduce the density, although I guess if you remove the land, perhaps not. There will be one building less there. On the Palm Road property, I know that we want to have environmentally or environmentally sensitive land for that property, but that does not preclude a retention pond on the one end of it, which is also part of the I-4 plans, does it?
No, it does not.
Okay. And some of the other encouragements and coordination, I think, are good to have policies for, even if we're regularly doing them. As far as proactive coordination between the city and the school about identifying properties, we're almost built out. So the opportunities for such collaboration seem limited.
Correct.
But having a policy for it is just fine, because we could have, during a redevelopment phase, we could have property come available that formerly had another use. Did I understand correctly, however, that that property could not, with this rewrite, be in an industrial zoned area?
Correct.
Okay, I have a question about that, in that we have industrial zoned area adjacent to where Main Street and the townhouses are going to be. And I'm not looking to undercut that commercial basis in our city at all. But conceivably, an industrial park, if it were not thriving, could have a large enough space for a school, and would be adjacent to, within a half mile of densely populated area. So I would have a little bit of pause about precluding such a very theoretical, in the distant future kind of development by this policy. And I understand that there is a conflict, because one part says they can be in any zone and the other part says it can't be an industrial. But thinking of specific areas in our city, to me, there are some areas there that might be such a potential. I don't know. In the future, distant.
Right.
Because you'd have to overcome access and road infrastructure and everything else. So I have a bit of a pause on that one. City Manager, what is your thought about an ironclad not in industrial? And actually, the underlying industrial in the part of the TOD that we were considering an appropriate site was industrial prior to the TOD.
Well, it was an industrial PUD, but the underlying zoning, which has been expired, was expired before they sold the property, was B9 and B4.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll have to take a look at that. Obviously, you have a power plant that it's in the IPUD.
Right.
And the questions, would it go there?
Well, also across from Discount Propane, there is an industrial park. And I want it to continue to operate and have all those businesses with us.
Yeah.
But if it were, for some reason, a failing park, that might be an appropriate site. I don't know. There'd have to be lots of infrastructure, lots on Benson Junction or whatever else. But I'm saying foreclosing it, I guess you can amend this policy anytime that you would
Well, they
see
can
the
always
need to.
they can always apply for
An exception.
an exception or comp plan.
Okay,
Amendment.
so this exercise, even though it sets policies, does not mean that there couldn't be a one-off circumstance at some point in the future where an exception would be requested and could be entertained.
Council will always have the ability to hear requests for change in future land use or in changes of
correct.
zoning. They'll always have that option.
Okay. All right,
Unless,
that's,
of course, the Florida legislature
decides that we can't do that. We have to send it to Tallahassee every time. Okay, those were my questions. I think this has been a really good effort on everyone's part. I certainly am glad I was not immersed in those citations with 6 numbers and letters out in decimal points, and making sure that our text complies. And I'm always glad to see us polish up the language where it flows better and it's formatted better and all of that. So kudos to everyone that has worked on this, but those were just a couple of comments that I had after
Thank
the
you.
presentation. If there's no further discussion, the workshop is adjourned.